Okay, thank you all for coming back after lunch, and to those of you who aren't in the workshop, thanks for coming along. So for context, many of you in the room won't know this is part of a longer series of talks that we've been having over the month of March by our Theoretical Sciences Visiting Program scholars. And so we've had, I think, 7 or 8 talks so far, and then we've got another 3 this week to round us off. So I'm gonna introduce Laura now. I guess there's nothing more to say. So yeah, thanks for coming along. I'm delighted to introduce Laura D, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Yes, at the University of Colorado Boulder in the US. I think we've maybe regaled people with a tale of how we first met over poutine in Montreal. Yeah, I've been following Laura's work for many years, so I'm really interested to hear her talk on unraveling global change impacts to biodiversity and ecosystem services, particularly using interdisciplinary approaches. So please, Laura, take it away. You've got 40-ish minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks so much for the organizers and the OIS staff who have really made this like a very, very exciting workshop. This is a dream team of people to be interacting with this week, so I'm excited to share my work with you. So my lab's research combines global change ecology, economics, community ecology, and conservation science to understand the impacts of global change on ecosystems and how those changes are impacting nature's contributions to human well-being. And we use a range of approaches from interdisciplinary fields like causal inference, from econometrics, network science approaches, as well as trait-based approaches from ecology. So to study ecology today, we're implicitly studying global environmental change because global change is impacting biodiversity and ecosystems with consequences for people that depend on these ecosystems. And throughout my talk, when I'm talking about global environmental change, I'm talking about things like climate change, land use change, invasive species, or overharvest. And a motivating question for my research program, and I'll give you a taste of this today, is how global change is going to alter biodiversity, ecosystem function, and ecosystem services. And throughout the talk, when I'm talking about ecosystem services, I'm talking about the diverse ways that nature contributes to human well-being. So these can be through things like typical market valued products like fish or timber, to pollination of crops, as Rachel just talked about, coastal protection, as well as cultural services or the intrinsic biodiversity, the intrinsic value of biodiversity in itself. And so while we know that people depend on ecosystems for their well-being, we know that ecosystems are changing with global environmental change. Disentangling the relationships between global change impacts on ecosystems and what that means for services is still really hard, and there's still a lot we really don't know. And I'm going to talk about 3 gaps that the talk today is going to try to make advances to fill. So the first is that the focus of most ecosystem service studies, including the analyses that came out of the IPBES assessment, are really focused on where ecosystem services are and in what quantity. So a typical approach will take a land cover map, land cover categories, and associate an average value of a service with a land cover type. But this misses how big disturbance events and also ecological interactions within a system, by the way, change ecosystem services. So this leads to a need for new interdisciplinary approaches that take into account more of the ecological research that's going on, as well as more social ecological understanding. And we know from global change ecology that we're building this growing body of knowledge about how global change drivers are impacting populations and communities, ecosystems, and sometimes functions. But the next gap is that many of these studies stop short from truly measuring ecosystem services and metrics of human well-being. So in order to apply this knowledge, we need to test and understand to what extent do these insights apply to services? So how do metrics of biodiversity change and ecosystem function change apply to services? And when do those relationships break down? So that's a focus of some of the parts of this talk. And then finally, you'll see I have examples of different small scale experiments. And Rachel just alluded to this in her presentation, but a lot of our understanding of impacts of global change on communities and empirical settings, as well as the relationships between biodiversity and ecosystem function, come from these small scale experimental studies that have conditions that might make it hard to generalize to larger scales and natural systems where the processes are really different. So I'm interested in how we can overcome this trade-off that we have, where experiments are the gold standard for causal inference, but they also are limited in their ability to generalize to natural systems where processes might be really different. So I'm interested in developing approaches to do causal inference and observational data by taking techniques from other disciplines that have wrestled with these problems for a lot longer than ecology. So the first part of the talk is going to be focused on quantifying impacts of disturbances and biodiversity change on ecosystems and ecosystem services. So motivated by this methodological challenge and gap about whether metrics of stability of ecological communities predict the stability of functions and services. And the second part, which depending on length, we may skip over, is causal inference and an application of these techniques to biodiversity and ecosystem function questions to get at this broad problem about whether experimental results generalize to natural systems where the processes can be really different. So the first part of the talk is going to have two projects. The first is considering extreme windstorms in forests, and then the second to think about food webs in coastal ecosystems, so increasing complexity. And the first part of this talk is motivated by this increase in mega disturbances that we're seeing with climate change, like larger storms, insect outbreaks, mega fires, like in Colorado, my backyard, big droughts, and heat waves. And so what we're seeing with climate change is that disturbances are shifting, so more intense events are becoming more probable. And that's pushing ecosystems outside of their historical disturbance regimes, even ecosystems well adapted to disturbances like forests. And we also, you'll notice in this picture, we have uncertainty over disturbance events because they're stochastic in nature. So it makes it hard to predict when they're going to happen and where at any given place. And so I'm interested in developing methods to anticipate the impacts of disturbances on ecosystems and services, and particularly focused on the consequences of shifting disturbance regimes and whether or not the predictions for ecological community change map on to ecosystem service change. And this is a collaboration I'm leading with ecologists, economists, and mathematicians. And a key contribution of our approach is really thinking about uncertainty over disturbance regimes and how they're changing in the future. And just to provide some background about why this is a contribution, we can think about how ecologists typically approach disturbance studies. So there are many retrospective empirical analyses where a disturbance happens, and then you look and compare before or after, or we'll do an experiment and apply a treatment of a particular intensity, or use very complex process-based models where it's hard to parameterize and add a lot of uncertainty. As I mentioned before, ecosystem service studies completely ignore disturbances and only consider average conditions. And here we're developing a modeling framework to model a distribution of potential disturbances and different disturbance regimes that are uncertain, which leads to a range of potential futures. And we've created a general mathematical framework, and these are the components of it, where we have a disturbance regime. We apply that regime to an ecological community. We generate an expected community, translate that to services. And we use functional traits to describe those relationships. And then I'm not going to talk about it today, but we also have a component of that that incorporates human values to translate that to different types of benefits to people. And we are considering traits at the forefront of this as a useful simplification because the consequences of disturbances can depend on the characteristics of species. So traits can help predict responses, but also the effects of species on ecosystem function. And here's an example in a forest where a storm has come through, and you can see that some trees are blown down and others aren't. And they also contribute differently to the carbon cycle, for instance. And so with this theoretical model, we have application to severe windstorms in northern Minnesota using forest inventory data in over 700 plots in 11 counties. And in these plots, we have detailed information about different tree species and their sizes. And did I say that we're doing windstorms? We're doing windstorms. So the first input to this approach is initial species community and the trait distribution of those species. And here we actually have individual level data. Then we take empirically known relationships between the size of the species and the probability of mortality. And these relationships can depend on the disturbance intensity and also the identity of the species. So we use that to generate an expected community using Monte Carlo simulations. Then we take that new community and use known ecosystem service production functions for different types of services. So here I'm going to show you one for timber. We've also done one for recreation. So one that doesn't depend on monetary value. So here we have the diameter of the species and then its contribution to timber volume. And then we can combine that with market data to get the expected value of different forest products. We do this for recreation as well. And this is just one iteration of this approach for one community and one disturbance intensity. But in reality, we do this thousands and thousands and thousands of times using Monte Carlo simulations. So we have different disturbance regimes. We grab the intensity with a certain probability. We apply the approach to each of the communities and so on. So we get a distribution of potential future communities and services. And then there's potentially things we want to measure from that output. So we can look at different dimensions of the services, like the expected value, the variance in that value for a particular disturbance regime and site, and the proportion of services retained after a disturbance happens. So I think inadvertently might have accidentally created a new stability metric, but that was not the goal. And then we can also look at things about the expected community. So we can compare the community before and after the disturbance and do that for different disturbance regimes. So I think there are some connections to response diversity here because this approach allows us to measure a single community in the face of a range of potential disturbance intensities, et cetera. So the first result is going to be looking at the expected proportion of service retained after the disturbance for a whole disturbance regime. So historical or under climate change where the disturbance gets more intense more frequently. And then we're going to have forest plot IDs from the forest inventory analysis that are going to be ranked from most to least resistant. And the key thing to note is that we're making a comparison to the status quo for ecosystem service approaches, which would just assume the line to be at 1 by ignoring disturbance. And so under the historical disturbance regime, you see that thinking about and incorporating disturbances, we'd predict an over 30% loss on average. And that loss grows when we think about a climate change scenario. And this would be missed in normal ecosystem service assessments. Then we're comparing the ecological community measure of resistance to the ecosystem service or functional resistance measure. So if these were closely related, which we think they might be considering how much timber depends on biomass, we would see a line like this. But really, we see very, very weak relationship or correlation between these two. And it gets even worse when we start to think about human responses to disturbances because people actually respond and the market reacts when disturbances happen, and that further decouples the ecological measures and the service measures. So from this example, we know that disturbances can have large impacts that vary with species trait composition, but the current ecosystem service approaches could miss this risk. And the ecological measures that we looked at fall short of predicting the ecosystem service changes, particularly when we allow the human dynamics to also change. But what about response diversity? A really easy extension of this would be to calculate the response diversity pre-disturbance and see if it predicts the post. And we haven't done that yet. So that could be something, a very easy extension. But finally, this work really focuses on how we need interdisciplinary approaches to map from the risk of impacts from disturbances all the way to real measures of human well-being. And I'm interested in expanding this to other types of disturbances and systems, and these are hypothetical ones. Pollinators are among my interests, so we should talk. So if you're interested, please contact me. But the next thing I'm going to talk about is that we really ignored a lot of complexity in the system. We looked at only trees, we didn't incorporate species interactions, and I'm wondering how species interactions might change the conclusions about the predictability of services from ecological measures. So this is really focused on whether considering interactions change those conclusions. And the premise is that threats to ecosystems are hard to anticipate and manage because species depend on one another in complex ways. So if we have ocean acidification or eutrophication that causes a local extinction of this bivalve, that might have cascading impacts on other species that depend on it. Yet, most ecosystem service studies focus only on the groups of species that directly provide a service, like this fish for fisheries or bird watching. Not that people are bird watching for seagulls, but I'm not much of a birder. So is this missing indirect threats to species or species that are playing indirectly critical roles in services? And we can use approaches from food webs to think about that question, particularly robustness methods that calculate the tolerance of a food web to species loss and the potential for secondary extinctions when species lose their resources. So this is asking whether or not food web robustness and ecosystem service robustness are related. And part of this is that do species play indirectly critical roles in services and are they threatened? Because we could have a scenario, for instance, where these two metrics are not related, like if the direct service providers are more threatened than the ones indirect, or vice versa, where there could be species that are threatened and they don't actually play major roles indirectly or directly in services. So these two things could be related, but they may not be. And then the second part of this is, do predictions from theory on robustness play out in the field? Because that's really the second ingredient we need for this type of work to be management and policy relevant. We need field validation. So the first part is entirely theoretical, but we did an application to salt marsh ecosystems led by my former PhD student, Aislinn Keyes. And salt marshes are a great example to test this case because they provide a wide variety of services: bird watching, fisheries, carbon storage, waterfowl hunting, etc. And we link food webs to ecosystem services using network approaches where we have species that are interacting and the links or edges are feeding relationships. And then we also add nodes in as services into these networks where here the edges are that the species contributes to a service or not. So not a true multi-layer network, but yeah. And then we added in these 7 different services and 3 different systems. So we get a network that has species nodes and service nodes, and then these 2 different types of links. And this data is all available online. Then we calculate robustness for the species in the food web and then the service. And we do this by simulating 12 different patterns of species losses that are based on system-specific threats. So there's a direct loss of a species, and then we track which species would be lost when it loses all of its resources, and then which services would be lost when it loses all the species that provide it. And then measure that as the area under the curve, where we have the fraction of species directly removed and the fraction of species remaining. And then we can compare the food web robustness on the x-axis with the ecosystem service robustness on the y-axis. And the different colors are going to be the different sequences of species losses or scenarios, and the shapes are the different systems. So if we have points up here, it means that ecosystem services are more robust than the food webs that provide them. Here means that the food webs are more robust than the services, and then in between means that they're closely related. And we do see that they are very closely related, and there's quite a bit of variation in the actual levels of robustness depending on the loss scenario. And we also find substantial amounts of variation across the different service types. So for instance, here's bird watching, which is less robust than shoreline stabilization, and more details can be found in this paper. And this is partially an artifact that there are no top-down effects in these methods. So bird watching are just coming from species from higher trophic levels. So this work found that food webs and ecosystem service robustness are highly related. And this implies that theory from food web ecology can help us understand vulnerability of ecosystem services to threats. But this all relies on the assumption that the theory on robustness actually can help us predict real co-extinctions in nature. And so that's what we're testing now. So this is ongoing work. It's really hot off the press with my co-PI, Ali Barner at Colby College, Dana Morton, a postdoc that worked with us, and Henry Lee, who's a PhD student in my group. And we're testing these ideas in the Gulf of Maine, where we've seen a large-scale die-off of the blue mussel that played a very important role in the food webs. And we're comparing the predictions made from the approach I just showed you, simulating species loss, to experimental species removals, where we can actually then look at the observed co-extinctions through time. So the approach is to create this meta web for the Gulf of Maine, and here are the connections of the 3 species we're going to remove experimentally. We then, from the meta web, develop local food webs for all the experimental plots and sites. We generate simulations of different orders of these species being lost to track the predicted number of species remaining. And then we've done experimental removals. And the preliminary results, oh, right, of course, important part. Then Ali's group has been actually monitoring the experiment every month for the last 3 years to track potential changes in the communities, so then we can actually look at the observed versus predicted co-extinctions. And the preliminary results show very little correspondence between the theoretical prediction and what's observed, but I think it actually leads to some really interesting questions and new directions for theory and empirical studies. So let me just show you what this looks like. Here we have the proportion of species removed in the experimental plots and the proportion remaining. So here's the control plot at 1. And then we did simulations of random removals of those 3 species in different orders for 500 simulations. And the communities are pretty robust, but some do crash in the prediction. Then we're going to add on the different experimental treatments where we removed in a factorial combination barnacles and a fucus algae, mussels, et cetera, in all the combinations. And what we see is that really the points are all over the place. And what I think is really, really interesting is actually this area above the line. So there's actually communities where once we've removed a couple of the species, there's many, many more species that have come in, and many of them weren't even in our original species list in the food web. So this is what it looks like. We have a totally different community that's assembled with different ephemeral algae species, totally different dominance of snails. And this has happened within 2 years of the experiment. And our models really didn't allow us to have these new species coming in a more meta-community open system framework. And what's also interesting is we also see a lot that have crashed a lot more quickly than theory would predict. And we do think it's because of loss of key positive interactions. And we're measuring that now. So this is, I think, the questions for you all. What could be driving this mismatch, and what are the implications for theory in this area, but also for us as we're thinking about developing theory for response diversity and designing ways we can actually measure it in the field. So the theory that we used had no rewiring, where species, when they're lost, can change what their resources are. There were no non-trophic interactions, and in this system, those are really important. And there was no assembly and meta-community dynamics, which we're clearly seeing to be important. So it points to new directions for theoretical development in this area. But it also points to potential limitations of only relying on ecological experiments to test theory for causal understanding. Because in this system, here's the plot, but you can see it's a small plot in a highly open system. So we also can't really remove all the possible combinations of species that we would want to. It's just not tractable. Even doing this was a massive feat. So the summary of this work is that robustness theory fails to predict community responses to experimental losses, but it does point to exciting research directions to reconcile the theory and experiments. And ongoing work is also looking at the ecosystem function responses. And we have a new study that's starting looking at the non-trophic interactions, positive interactions. And this is work that's going to be led by some of my PhD mentees. Okay, so whether or not metrics of biodiversity change predict ecosystem service change, I would say there's mixed and inconclusive results, which is potentially not very satisfying, but I think hopefully these approaches provide a systematic framework to be thinking about this across a wider range of systems. And next, I'll talk about the other area of research that I think is also important for thinking about response diversity and how we might test some of the theoretical predictions in the field, which is using modern causal inference approaches. And here, this work is really focused on this trade-off that I mentioned, where in experiments, we have high what's called internal validity. So ability to interpret a correlation as a causal relationship, but low external validity, meaning ability to generalize. And we have the opposite problem in observational data, where there's a lot of confounding variables and other things that make it hard to actually isolate a causal effect. But if we want to scale up ecological understanding beyond small scale experiments, we're going to have to rely on this wealth of new observational data that's available, which also means we're going to need a new statistical toolbox. And I've been very interested in the last 5 or so years of thinking about how we can bring and adapt methods from other fields that don't have the same rich history of doing experiments, like public health, economics, epidemiology, where you can't actually, make a pregnant woman drink wine to see the effects on birth outcomes, right? So there's ethical constraints. And in response, these fields have developed robust frameworks to really understand how we can tease apart causal relationships and observational data. And so as an application of this, I recently published a paper applying some of these methods to this question of how biodiversity change in natural systems impacts ecosystem function. And particularly, I'm revisiting this question of the effects of plant biodiversity and the effect on productivity using the observational or control plots in the nutrient network. So this includes 43 sites with at least 5 years of data. from several different continents. And even looking at this map of these sites, you can see that they span huge environmental gradients, huge gradients of land use, and have many, many different species. So those are all potential confounding variables that make it really hard for us to say, oh, this is the effective species richness on productivity, separate from these different confounding effects. So what I did was I compared what a typical design in ecology would do, where we would measure as many different confounding variables as possible and try to control for them in a statistical regression. And actually, this data set has so many things measured, so it's really, really rich. Things like grazing, temperature, water, soil types, precipitation, as well as other dimensions of community composition and cover. So when we apply this approach, this is what we find, where we have the species richness change on the x-axis and the estimated effect size on productivity on the y. We see what we typically think of when we think of the effect of biodiversity on productivity. That a 10% increase in species richness increases productivity by 3.8% on average. So consistent with what experiments find. But we know that even though we had over 60 variables that we controlled for, there's still unobserved confounding variables that are missed, like different pollinators across the sites, drought impacts that are different across the sites, various things that we know are affecting both biodiversity and productivity that could lead to bias estimates. So we're taking a different approach here that is trying to deal with unobserved confounding variables across sites and plots. So here is an example where a typical approach will look at, we have plots within a site, and we'll look at between site variation. So we have different species, we might have some observed characteristics like temperature that we control for in a regression, but we're still using between site variation. But there could still be these gradients in unobserved confounding variables. And random effects don't cut it. So we have a preprint on that as well. So what these approaches do from panel regression methods from econometrics is they shift the variation to within site variation to remove the effects of unobserved confounding variables at the plot and at the site by year level. And these are called two-way fixed effects estimators. And Jarrett Burns and I have a preprint out now that's explaining these methods in more detail and showing how they can improve upon using mixed effects models with random effects, which lead to a lot of bias in your estimates and don't deal with unobservables. So when we do this, we come to the exact opposite conclusion about the effect, that we actually see a negative effect of having more species on productivity. And so this led to a lot of confusion and a lot of pushback from, including from my co-authors. Akira was there to witness. And so this led to a lot of conversation. So could this difference in our results be actually that our estimator is biased? Because there could be confounding variables that are plot specific varying through time. There's certainly potential for reverse causality where we know productivity also affects diversity. And there's a lot of measurement error, right? Also the dynamic effects where last year's productivity affects this year's diversity and so on. So we probed the crap out of all these assumptions using 4 designs and 1 sensitivity analysis that each make different assumptions about sources of bias and sources of confounding. So one looked at prior productivity and other dynamic confounding variables. One looked at ruling out the effect of productivity on biodiversity, and also other things that are unobservable at the plot scale through time, like measurement error, that might be plot specific. We also use a sensitivity test that's not shown here. So we found pretty consistent results across all these measurements that found no evidence for a positive effect. And of course, we attributed that to being able to control for a wider range of confounding variables from past observational studies, but that doesn't help us explain why we're seeing such different results from the experiments where those confounding variables aren't an issue. So really was scratching my head and looking at the data thinking about like, what could the difference be? So we saw that on average, when we see higher numbers of species and higher changes in species, these are really driven by more non-native species and more rare species in natural systems. And I went back to the experimental data, Big Bio and BioCon, and looked at the data, also comparing it to data I have from the Department of Natural Resources in Minnesota, and actually looked, and those species are not typically rare. They're typically very dominant in natural communities, and there were not any non-naturalized invasive species. So these types of species are not typically planted in these field experiments in representative proportions. So we asked, do invasive species lower productivity and are rare species less productive, which by definition, we think they might be. And so we then broke up the species richness into these different groups of rare native, non-rare native, non-rare non-native, and rare non-native. There were not that many of those. And we found that rare species had negative effects and these non-native ones on average, although this result was less conclusive. And then if we actually look at the species, the native, non-rare common species that are typically planted in the experiments, they tend to have a positive effect, although it's not very precisely estimated because they weren't varying that much through time. So we couldn't really separate their effect. So our results are able to be reconciled with experiments that with the species that are actually planted in those experiments, we do see a positive effect. It's just that the biodiversity change in our data is not being driven by those species. So in conclusion, causal inference and observational data is underutilized in ecology, but it complements experiments, and it can let us try to get at some of these natural processes that we can't necessarily include in experiments because they happen at larger scales, or we might not know about them. The other thing to really note about this is that species differ in their effects, and it matters if we go, which two species we go from to 4 species, right? So this creates a lot of challenges for generalizing because you can't really generalize beyond what's being studied in the system. So that's a bummer. And that our field's future really lies in a iterative approach where we're testing theory not only in an experimental framework, but also in observational data. And for instance, this study prompts some interesting directions for thinking about rare species in biodiversity function experiments. And what's next from this is a new 5-year grant where working with Megan and others, where we're interested in thinking about the direct and indirect effects of drought on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And we're working with the DroughtNet team as well as other LTER global change experiments to apply these types of techniques for mediation analysis. And one part of this that I want to mention, because I must have talked really fast, I'm sorry, is that part of this grant is a big education component where I'm going to be doing a big distributed graduate seminar. That's how Dave and I met. So that's going to be focused on causal inference and global change, inclusive team science practices, and reproducible workflows. And the idea is that we want to get people familiar with how to interact and collaborate in teams in an inclusive way. So there'll be training there from a facilitator, as well as give people an opportunity to use some of these different tools with open source education materials. And this will be in the fall of 2025. So if you're interested in having a section of it, let me know. I think it's a really great way for graduate students to network and build their own collaborative teams and get a taste of using some of these methods too. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. And thank you especially to my collaborators and grad student Megan and others. Yeah.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
A really great talk, as always. Perfectly on time, well done. So we've got 5 minutes or so for questions. We'll start with Frederick back there.
Thanks. I'm curious to see, so for the removal experiments, did you also do plots where you didn't remove anything and you just observe if there's species accumulation through time?
Oh, interesting. So we do have control plots. I have not looked at that yet, but we definitely should. But even that being said, I don't know about the number of species, but we see a really different identities of species, like these ephemeral algae that I think are typically outcompeted when you have the dominant fucus and barnacles there. So we do see some different species that we're not seeing in the control plots, and I do know that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Could you make a connection to those new communities, I guess, to new services? Like new potential services due to the community being.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. We are monitoring them. So we're also looking at the size distribution of different species to look at biomass, water filtration, and then secondary production. I don't know if we collected primary production because that would have been really important. Yeah. But we will, that's the goal, to try to measure that. I don't know if we designed it in a way that we're collecting data on all the different types of services that might be most relevant, which, like, hindsight is 2020, but that's a great question.
Question, Louise?
Thanks, Laura. That was pretty amazing. I was just wondering, at some point, maybe I misunderstood what you said, but at some point I believe you said something like robustness theory doesn't really hold or behave as we expect it to. But I wonder if really the problem is not the theory of robustness, so that understanding that the more species you lose secondarily, the more unstable your network is. Maybe I wonder if the issue is just that our models are just little boxes that do not have the complexity that you're getting when you're looking at a plot. So I wonder if you went large scale enough, if you were able to do experiments on the whole beach, would that be more?
Yeah.
It's almost impossible because you're in a marine setting, so you're getting everything.
Yeah.
But I wonder in a terrestrial sort of environment where you can sort of control influx and outflux of individuals and species, maybe the theory would hold more.
Yeah, no, I think, the iteration of this theory that we've done so far is like a very simple one that I showed the preliminary results for. We're also doing dynamic models parameterized to the system to compare that as well. But I do think you hit on something important, that this is like a super open system. And probably not the best system, but I also think that the theory is like some of the robustness metrics are remove 50% of the species, right? Which doing 3 different combinations of 3 species was like nearly impossible, right? So I do think there's still some mismatches, but it could be overcome. And we actually had a paper that's reviewing some of this more broadly for terrestrial systems. And there are some really nice examples in terrestrial systems testing the theory, less so in marine systems. And I think there was more correspondence there, but still not, like, unexpected things came up.
One more, I think Fred had something.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Really interesting as always. I was just wondering, it's kind of riffing off Sarah's was saying around the robustness with your networks. I didn't get a feel for it just from the slides, but were the links weighted within those networks, or were they binary? Because that could be another reason for you had that left shift. That could be another reason if you don't have those interaction strengths in there. Potentially, it can work both ways, right? That they could fall apart slightly quicker or depending on where those strengths lie, but also the abundances of within those nodes.
Yeah, we don't. I mean, we do have abundance in biomass, so we could make some assumptions and try that. And certainly there would be some interaction strength consideration in the dynamic models where we'll be essentially making up a lot of the parameters. So maybe there's some other approaches. I'd love to talk to you about it.
Okay, thank you, Laura.
Okay.
Maybe now, should we take a 5-minute break? And then afterwards. For those of you in the workshop, we'll come back in 5 minutes.
But I was like, don't just go over here.
Yeah, excellent.